want to introduce Ray Shealy. Ray is a serial entrepreneur. He has been a great asset to the startup community in Columbus and a great friend to Rev1. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Ray is currently the CEO of SafeWhite, executive chairman of TicketFire, and he's a board member of a company called Noxsano, which is a development stage medical device company. We'll talk about all of those. Early in his career, Ray helped transform HTP from a niche payer-focused software company to an Inc. 500 healthcare informatics company focused on payer, provider, and healthcare information exchange software. He led HTP through several rounds of fundraising, eventually to a merger with McKesson in 2008, and then served as general manager of McKesson's Relay Health from 2008 through 2009, where he got another dose of working for a large company. He served as a senior vice president at desktop services at T-Systems North America, and he also helped it grow to a $300 million IT services company. He co-founded Technology Asset Management and then also held executive positions at IBM. Ray is a CPA with a bachelor's degree from Ohio State University. I think when you graduated, it was still Ohio State and not the Ohio State. That's correct. And so one of my favorite questions to start off with an entrepreneur is, why are you here?
Well, you know, I've always had a little entrepreneurial spirit. Even when I did the accounting thing back at Ohio State, I kind of went into public accounting in Chicago and was in the entrepreneurial services group at Ernst & Young. So, you know, started out with a good foundation of accounting, but knew I always wanted to be in, you know, high growth or starting, you know, new companies. And I did 2 years in audit there, and I learned a lot about, you know, seeing a lot of different businesses because you go around and do the audit, and met a lot of really cool entrepreneurs through that process. And that helped solidify that that was something that I, you know, wanted to eventually get into. But I didn't, where it's kind of in vogue today to go right from college to a startup. I don't think it was it wasn't the case necessarily, as old as I am, back in the early 90s to do that.
So you said you always wanted to do something entrepreneurial, but when did the bit flip as you're doing audit and accounting work that you don't want to work for somebody else anymore? You want to be on the operations side.
Yeah, I guess you know, I had a pretty strong work ethic, and so after 2 years in audit, I'm like, this isn't for me. I'm not really happy doing it. You know, I'd kind of open the door to go into the next gig, and I'd kind of get sick to my stomach, like, I hate this. I can't do this any longer. So I ended up at a company in Oak Brook, Illinois. It was called Chrysler Systems Leasing, and they were the first computer leasing company to lease a lot of desktop and PC computers. And so they had a lot of big companies telling, like Texaco came to us and said, how many PCs do we have? Well, that was our billing file, right? So we're like, oh, you have 35,392. And they're like, wow, that's really cool. You know right where they're at. And because you had to pay sales and use tax, we could tell them all about their technology assets and where they were. And so the CEO of that division of Chrysler Financial that was, you know, focused on technology leasing had this idea: let's create some software to help all these big companies manage their technology assets. And so we did that, and they hired an executive out of Texas. It was from a computer reseller, and he came in, and then I was the product manager for the software to create this, and I worked my butt off that year, and we got rated #1 by Gartner Group. And and then they turned around and sold it to IBM, and I had no equity in the company. So I was like, okay, what do I get for this? I get oh, congratulations, you have a job at IBM. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't have any equity. So then I learned from the, you know, front lines right there. I'm like, okay, next time I do this thing, I'm going to make sure I have some kind of, you know, piece of the action, so that if you work hard and build something, you can also share in, you know, in the rewards of that. So that was kind of like a lesson on the front lines. But so then after that was later. Then what I did is my colleague, the guy that they brought in from Texas, he raised $5 million from MicroAge. My father had passed away in an accident, so I moved back to Ohio. And he said, he called me up and said, hey, I know you just moved back to Ohio, but I just raised $5 million. Let's go do this. Let's just go do a startup. And I'm like, wow, okay, can I do that from Ohio? And so we worked it out, and I did. But then that was eventually the company that we ended up selling to T-Systems. So it took us about 18 months and we sold it. So that was pretty cool.
So one of the things you mentioned is you were being a product manager for a software product. You have an accounting background. You're executive chair of TicketFire, which is really software, HTTP software. So where do you get the skill sets to learn how to manage the product development process and the production level code that has to go into a company to make sure that it's scalable and operable for the customer, not having a IT background yourself or a product background?
Well, I mean, I did a little bit of coding back, when I was in high school and that kind of thing, but and in college just to get through the business school. But
okay, that was using an abacus.
Yeah, well, no, right, or a Trash 80, the Radio Shack thing. So I think when I had that role at Chrysler where they ended up, IBM bought the software off of that. That was really I just learned the front lines, and I think one of the key things is, back in those days, you could move faster than you could with COBOL or whatever. So Power Builder was what we were doing it in, which was like a 3G language, which was like, Windows, and it's like really cool to see that kind of software. But, you still learn the fundamentals, and a lot of those fundamentals apply to today. And you could go faster today, but not too fast. And so I think I just kind of, like water runs downhill, I just kind of learned how to do that. And we had a good team, and we invested in that team. And, I think just making sure that you can drive the development team but still respect, them and understand how they operate. And I just learned a lot. There was a guy there that was a CIO. He was a pretty sharp guy. I learned some things from him too. So just, through kind of like just working with people and being fortunate enough to see some good leaders that knew how to do it.
So one of the other things you just mentioned now, and I know is really important to you, is the whole concept of team. You're going about, consciously building a team. So can you talk about that a little bit in terms of your philosophy about team building and how you guide and direct teams, especially with early stage companies?
Yeah, I think this is hugely important for growing a company. And it's very hard to do in the early stages of a company. It's a lot harder than people think, by the way. So beginning with the end in mind, I like to start with collective intelligence. I'm a huge believer in collective intelligence. So a team of 7 people is way smarter than a team of 3 people. And if you look at the hierarchical way of American management, the way it's kind of grown up in the auto industry or whatever, it was like Lee Iacocca smoking a cigar telling people what to do, That's the wrong way of doing it in today's world. And so I believe everybody, like at SafeWhite, one of the things we do at SafeWhite is, I want to hear what the marketing people have to say about the science, and I want to hear what the science people have to say about the marketing. And, they might not, the science people might not be marketing experts, but you know what? They're pretty smart people, and they're pretty insightful, and they add a lot of value. And so I think unlocking that, that intelligence and the thought that are resonant in your teams, even though that might not be their role, you have to be careful because you got to balance it a little bit because you don't necessarily want your science people driving your marketing programs, but they have really good insight. And the same with the marketing people about the science. That's okay when they ask questions. Well, how does this work, or what's that do? So that's one example. And I think how you kind of orchestrate that, or you can't. There's a good balance to strike there, but that's really important. And another thing when you're in the early stage, like you can't afford to hire, like, I've been at IBM and I've been, at McKesson, and, I've had management teams of like 5 people that are making really good money, and, you're like, okay, well, let's attack that market, and you sit down, you strategize with them, and then they just go do it, right? Well, that's not in the world that we all live in when you're doing early stage. It's not like, I've got a team of, 5 P&Gers working at SafeWhite who have staffs of 30 people on them and can go do things. So in the early stages, what you've got to do is assemble this team that you can afford, right? And that they can grow. And then like with SafeWhite, what we did is we hired Carlos Martinez as our EVP to manage R&D, and we had some scientists that were outside the oral care industry and had good ideas and thought differently because they hadn't spent 23 years at P&G. And then you kind of combine that with what Carlos had done, and then you start to form a pretty cool team. right? And so I think that's one of the secret sauces of SafeWhite and why we're doing something here that nobody else has been able to do. We've created this kit, right? Nobody else has been able to figure out a way to coat teeth white and make them white instantly. It's kind of like nail polish for your teeth. 20 companies have tried, nobody's succeeded. And the reason I don't think they succeed, or why they failed, was because of the way that they probably structured their teams and how they have the, sometimes they get the innovator's dilemma and they kind of already are stuck with how they think about it. So this whole thing about teams is, it's the essence of building a successful company. People know that, but I think there's a lot of subtleties in how you put the team together, how you manage the team, how you coach the team, and then how you kind of set the culture for the company. And I don't have all the answers on this, by the way. I'm still learning every day. So I think I'm a lot better at it than I was, back in the days even at HTP 10 years ago. But it's very hard to do in a startup or early stage company. It's a lot easier to do at a bigger company, but then you have more politics and more red tape. But I like the early stage.
Well, one of the things you've mentioned before about SafeWhite in particular is you're the outlier in SafeWhite as a middle-aged white male, and so that's a construct of your team. And so from a perspective of diversity, inclusion, and capability, talk about that aspect of it as well.
Absolutely. I love, when you talk about collective intelligence, I love the whole idea of diversity. I think it's all part of collective intelligence, and everybody coming from different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities, different income levels is huge because people think about things different. And how you assemble that kind of creates this awesome patchwork of your foundation of the company. And so, at TicketFire, it's SafeWhite, very diverse teams. And I wouldn't say it was like consciously where I sat down and said, okay, we want to have, 25%, this or that or whatever. It's like, it kind of happened. But there's an openness that I think you have that attracts people. And once they come into an environment where they feel like, and they contribute every day, where they feel wanted, needed, and they feel like they're contributing every day, I think that kind of is overarching all of this. And then there wasn't any specific design in either one of those with, how many men or women are we going to hire and, any of that, how we put it together. It just kind of happened, but it's definitely a strength of both companies.
So how do you maintain that? So apparently you believe it works. So as the companies grow, and as you have less of a direct involvement in hiring the next employee as the companies get bigger, how do you maintain that as integral to the organizational essence? Well,
I wish we were bigger, Wayne, so that I was out of the day-to-day hiring decisions, but unfortunately that's not the case with either company. But I could tell you in how I think it'll play out with like SafeWhite, because I think that was going to grow to be a sizable company, and TicketFire certainly has a great opportunity for that too, or just in other companies, like when I was at HTP and we were 85 people. That's just part of your culture, right? So you set it out that we're hiring the best people that we can find for this, and like we have a culture at SafeWhite, where we've kind of laid out our core principles and core values, and I think those things are important, and I think you can't necessarily set them. It needs to come from the company and the people, but that's kind of how I think that manifests itself, as you grow.
So last week was Startup Week in Columbus, and an opportunity to engage with the broader community. So how do you see activities like Startup Week being instrumental to helping build and maintain a startup culture in Columbus, and what can we do to build on that across the rest of the year?
Yeah, I think Startup Week is interesting because, Rev1 has kind of become the hub for Columbus 2020 and the partnership for technology companies, but I don't think it should be the only thing. And I think there are other roles for others to play in the tech community, and I think Startup Week's a great example of that. What I've seen, I'll give you a couple examples with Startup Week, is that it's really good for people that are in the corporate environment and have a twinkle in their eye that they want to get into startups. It's a really cool way for them to like take an afternoon from work at Chase and go and learn about some topic with startups, and they kind of start to get a little bit of momentum, and then they maybe jump ship from the big company and go into a startup. The other thing that I would say, or I'll give you an example, is like Sarah Irizarry. She was brand manager for Crest White Strips in Crest for 5 years at Procter & Gamble, and we were fortunate enough to meet her. I met her at Startup Week like 3 or 4 years ago when I was on some panel, and she came up after me and said, "Hey, you might want to meet me. I used to be the brand manager for White Strips." I'm like, "Yes, let's talk." And and she was at Abbott at the time, and then she decided to leave, and she started her own thing where she sells probiotics on Amazon. But then we hired her a little over a year ago to help us really set the brand and the strategy for SafeWhite, and that's how we came up with our go-to-market brand is Halo Smile. So that she helped create that, and she still works with us as a consultant. And now we hired Sam Simon to run our marketing team. But that was how we kind of got the marketing engine going. Just one example was through Startup Week, and I wouldn't have met Sarah probably without that. So I think Startup Week, and I think a lot of these other things are just healthy for our community. And as we grow from 2 million people to 3 million people in this community, that's a lot of growth. And we have to find, I think Rev1's going to continue to grow. It's great to see Drive Capital. I think we'll have some other venture capital firms come along. So, it's just it's an exciting time in Columbus.
So what are some of the other things that you think we need in the community to help make that happen?
Well, I think, the biggest thing that's often overlooked when you go to like a Drive Capital or some of these big VC firms is they don't want to invest and write you that first check. So I'm a big believer, a lot of these companies I'm involved with, I wrote the first check, whether it's a $10,000 check or something. So I think what's hugely important to get, because your pipeline, right, you're going to have, 100 startups, whatever, 10 will be successful or whatever is going to happen. You have to have a big top of the funnel. And so I think that as we've added, investment firms in town, Rev1's done a good job with your Concept Academy and the Concept Fund. I think it's called Concept Fund, or however you do, to help write the first check. I think that's so important. And I think that we had the Ohio Tech Angel Fund, and that's a little harder for the first check just because of how it works. But I think it's a big asset of this town. And so I think we need to continue to have people in an ecosystem that has angels or just people that are involved that write the first check like the Concept Fund does, because that's what gets the initial thing, out of the starting gate. And I think we've been good at that in the past. I think we still can get better at that.
So when you talk to potential entrepreneurs, what are a couple of the kind of the myths about being an entrepreneur that you try to help dispel?
This is, being an entrepreneur is hard. And I mean, it's a lot harder than people think. It is the simplest way to describe it, because it's so in vogue right now for everybody that wants, because of Facebook and all the big things. Everybody graduates college, I want to get involved in a startup. And, they don't understand that means your job description is butcher, baker, candlestick maker. You're going to do everything. And, it's a roller coaster ride. It defines a roller coaster ride because the highs are high and the lows are low. And it's personal. And I remember when I was at IBM, we used to laugh. We'd close a big deal. And I remember one of our sales reps out of Texas, he's like, "Ray, we just closed $1 million deal." He's like, "We just raised earnings per share at IBM by 0.0001% today. Way to go. Don't you feel great?" And he was an entrepreneur. And so, in a big company, you just can't have the impact. So you can have the impact in the startup world, but it is so personal. And there's so many times, where I'll loan, in a couple cases I've had to loan, even when I was at HTP, I had to loan the company money to make payroll. Well, you got to be careful sometimes when you tell your employees that, hey, the only reason you got a paycheck today is because we got a loan, and I'm hoping to get paid back. So it's very intense, it's very personal, it's in your face, and it wears on you. It wears on you, physically, mentally, on your personal life. And it's super harder than anybody ever realizes. And so, one of my, when people say, "Hey, I want to be an entrepreneur," I'm like, I don't know if you want to do that. You might want to think twice about that. In fact, I'd recommend against it.
So, any questions?
Now, there's more to the story there,
well,
right?
Keep going.
Well, so if you're a true entrepreneur, you're going to hear that and you're going to say, I don't believe that. I want to take it on, right? They stand up. And that's a special skill set for somebody that's going to do that. But, because I've done like the IBM thing, and I've done the McKesson thing, and I've done the startup thing, and I've kind of seen the whole gamut. And it's very romantic to look back and say, oh, I remember those days at HTP when we were this little small company. And, it's oftentimes when you have those memories, you think about the positives and not the negatives. And I'm telling you, those negatives are really difficult times. But they make you better, right? They make you better, and we all know that. And when you go through life, when you're challenged, that's when you discover, who you are. And there have been times where I've been like distraught in the last 2 years with SafeWhite, where we were, I thought we were there and we were really here. And then it's like, oh my God, now I got to go raise more money from investors. Oh, it'd just be so much easier to close this thing up and go get a job at Cardinal Health. I mean, seriously, you go through things like that. And
that lasts a week.
Yeah, probably more like 15 minutes, but but they are hard times. And so then you like, okay, so what you gonna do? And then you just kick yourself, and you get it going again. So, but it's hard. It's really hard.
So there's an interesting opportunity to discuss something. I think a lot of people are concerned about, either going into a startup or any kind of business activity that gives them exposure, is the fear of risk, the fear of failure, especially the fear of failure. So, everything hasn't worked out that you've done. So talk a little bit about how one deals with failure and how you make use of that in your life and in your next round of business activities.
Yeah, Bill Gates was big on this in like the early 90s before, before Microsoft, grew up to be what it was. It was like they like to hire people that had failed in startups because they knew they learned a lot, right? And so I had some failures in the last decade in some of my angel investments, the biggest one being 9450/Infomotion Sports with the sensors in a basketball. We won the Consumer Electronics Award Show, or CES, Mobile App of the Year in 2015. It should have been the next Nest. Right, if you know what Nest is with the home thermostat, it should have been Nest for sports. And I had probably 20 investors behind me in that deal. And yeah, right. And that one, it's interesting because I was the biggest investor in that company. I put a lot of my personal net worth in that. I totally believed in it, and I helped it as much as I could. And we all lost all our money. And there were people in there that I thought, well, this liquidity preference will still make. What happened is the CEO ran the thing into the ground because he didn't want to give up control. He had 51%, and he'd been fired before by a VC firm, and he just, he had some issues, I think, and so he just drove it into the ground, bankrupted it. Now Spalding owns it. They bought it out of bankruptcy. I looked at doing that, but through that whole process, I learned, I always knew governance of a company was important, but I learned about 51% and how important that is. And, and I lost a lot of money because of it. And so I'm much more in tune because of that failure. And, I've lost a couple other little things that were real early stage. But a lot of the things I've invested in are doing good. And the ones that are doing good are ones where I like the management team. They're coachable, and we could go into all that. But, it's, some of those failures teach you a lot about what it takes to build the chemistry of a company that can be successful.
So how do you maintain balance?
Like work-life balance?
You can interpret the question any way you want.
Well, I think it's very important to get a routine that fits your personality and your style. My routine is I work out in the morning, and I come into work a little later than I used to, because that just kind of works for me. But then I work a little later than most people, and then I come back, home. My kids are getting older now; they're all going to be in college next year, so it's not as important. When I was younger, I would, coach soccer and do all kind. I had no time for myself for like a decade, and then after I'd get the kids to bed, then I'd get on the computer and work for another 2 or 3 hours, and I'd get up and go for a run at 6 a.m. and than go into the office. So now that my kids are older, I have a little bit more time. It's kind of cool to recover some of that, so I can put a little bit more in. But I think the balance comes down to, I'm work hard, play hard. I like to take good vacations, but I'll buckle down. And I think the ability to focus when you need to focus and being aware of when you need to focus is hugely important. And so for the last 2 months, like on SafeWhite, it's a weird thing. Like, I'm like, okay, it's time to raise money. I'm like, well, it's kind of always time to raise money, but like, no, you really need to go raise money right now. And it's amazing, like I just go out and talk to people, and one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, you got somebody writing a check because they hear your story, they hear what you're doing, and they get, because a lot of these investors, when you get them in the early stage, not only do they want to make money, but it's also emotional for them. Like, I think as sometimes the entrepreneurs, this is one thing I've discovered in the last couple of years, and that helps bring the balance. So what I'm saying is, like, I'm out raising money, but I'm really out having fun with a friend. And I tell the people, like at SafeWhite, I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to see an old buddy. I'm out raising money. I know this is weird. I'm going to the Kentucky Derby with a couple guys. Well, I might raise some money, I might not, but I'm going to have fun. So that finding the balance is also that. So that's kind of how it works. But then I'd also say it's a drawback, because when you're an entrepreneur, it's 24/7, right? So the fact that I'm at the Kentucky Derby with some buddies, ask them to invest, means I'm always on, right? So like, even though I'm there having fun, you don't really get to relax. And that's the grind of this. Like, yeah, in today's world, we all know it's 24/7. You never get away from your mobile phone, et cetera. But when you're working at Cardinal Health or Chase, your boss isn't going to freak out if on Saturday night, you don't respond to something. But when you got an investor or something comes up, you're always on. So you got to find that balance, because being in these early stage businesses, you never get to sleep, technically.
So you have a handful of people that you've worked with pretty closely over the years, as advisors, co-investors, co-members of management teams. Can you talk about having that sort of built-in network of support and resources?
Yeah, I mean, that's key, so that when things are going tough, that you can go to some trusted advisors and run things by them, because they have more life experiences and have more wisdom on things. And so, yeah, I've got a group of folks that, whether they're social friends or business friends or what have you, that I turn to, and I think it's absolutely key to have that. Everybody needs a sounding board, right? Whether it's your parents, your family members, or anybody else. As you go through life, you need it, and certainly it's even more so, highly important in early stage businesses, just because of the intensity and the risk that you're taking. And you're talking about losing people money, right? That's pretty stressful. I hate to lose anybody any money, and that's like one of my core values, right? When it comes to these startups, I have this one guy. He's pretty funny, because he's invested in about every one of the things that I have kind of going on right now. He says to me, Ray, now I'm deploying my soldiers to your company here, and my soldiers like to win their battles. Can you please make sure that you take care of my soldiers while they're with you in battle? So, it's guys like that just make it more entertaining. But, I think that also helps you when, like on InfoMotion Sports, a lot of us lost money. But at the end of the day, a lot of the people that I brought to that deal, they didn't lose as much as I did, right? So that kind of, I think, helped get some credibility for the whole thing, and they knew I tried my hardest to make that thing a success. So, and some of those people are some of my advisors now,
So as a executive level, so CEO and executive board chair of the companies that you're involved with, what are some of the things that you think are really important for the entrepreneurs, the operators, to have in their head all the time? What are some things they need to have at their fingertips in terms of understanding about the business to make sure they keep it on the rails?
Well, I'll go back to the foundational things. It's all about the team and the talent. So as an entrepreneur, you always have to be, finding talent, recruiting the talent, hiring the talent, and always interviewing people, whether you're doing it informally or not, so that when you do have the funding, that you can bring the talent in, because you're not going to grow the business successfully without talent. So it's all about people, right? I mean, finding good people inspiring the people, motivating them, focusing them in the right direction, finding the right balance between, I'm big on letting people do their jobs, but the moment that I suspect something's off track, I'm in the details. And I tell them that. I'm like, okay, you guys go build this thing. I hope it works. Because if not, I'm going to be in here and we're going to be tearing this thing apart. We're going to figure it out together, but I'm trusting you to do this right. So I think trust is big. I'm big on that. I think you need to let people do their job, but you also have to coach and mentor them. And I think that's, some of the challenges with these early stage companies. And the guys at TicketFire and I have talked about this. I mean, none of us are really experts in the ticketing space. And I got into it just because I was a frustrated season ticket holder at Ohio State and I hated Ticketmaster. I'm like, they can't make this much money off of reselling my tickets. This is ridiculous. So, that one thing led to another. But, in TicketFire, it's a young group and they're super talented, but they also, we all recognize we lack experience. And so we're self-actualized about that. So we went out and we found some people that are really experienced that advise us. But I think, those are some of the fundamental things that you look for in when you're looking at these companies it's the talent. And then, it's the horse or the jockey thing. Okay, what's the idea? How strong is the horse in the race, right? Well, oftentimes whatever the company starts out with is not what the idea that they end up being successful with. And so you have to be open to changing. And we're doing that right now at TicketFire, and we've certainly made some changes at SafeWhite. So it's a whole myriad of things, and it's just, but if you get good people, so you can find your way out, right? That good jockey can get the horse across the finish line, even though it might not be the most talented horse. So that's why I like it. It's all about people.
What about cash?
Well, you can't hire the people without the cash. So that's a good question. The cash is super important. And, that's a beauty of TicketFire is we're kind of like hovering on cash flow positive and we got money in the bank. So that's great, but we also recognize that might not go on forever unless we find our next thing. So cash is huge. And it's an art form on how you get that into your company without giving up all your equity. It's an art form. There's no science to it. Like I said, a lot of these investors that write early stage checks, I'll tell you one of the tricks I have for raising cash is I do what the SEC and what a lot of attorneys would tell me I shouldn't do, and that might hurt me someday, but I give a very detailed quarterly report to all of our investors. So if you're an investor in SafeWhite, TicketFire, you are going to get a quarterly report that's going to be 4 to 5 pages long, and it's going to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly about what's going on in the business. And I do that for really a couple of reasons. Number one is I think it's good to have people informed. So there are oftentimes entrepreneurs, they want, they schmooze an investor, then they get to know that investor, and that investor writes a check, and then all of a sudden the investor never hears from that entrepreneur again unless they pick up the phone and call them. And that's just poor etiquette in my mind. So if somebody writes you a check, you need to continue to be proactive and communicative with them and let them know what's going on. And so I've had attorneys say, why do you send out that quarterly report? You're exposing yourself because you're not saying all the things that, whatever, okay. I mean, you got to take risks, right? And so that has helped me to get a reputation with investors that they know they're going to hear the facts. And, I know a lot of other entrepreneurs in town, a couple of them invested in successful companies, and they do the opposite. They don't want to share any information with anybody. They just hoard it all themselves, and for whatever reason, that's just how they're wired. So I think getting the cash, that's one of my recommendations on how you get cash, and I know there's like a couple guys here where the investors have said, hey, go talk to Ray and get a template from him on how if I'm going to invest in your company, I want to see reports like this on how you're doing. So that is a key thing for getting the cash is communicating and doing it proactively rather than reactively, because it's amazing when you take that, it's just an open approach, and when you take that open approach, it helps you get other investors, because then they're like, okay, well, this is it's working good. So
both of these are consumer-based companies, but they're quite different. So how do you do the brain divide to manage these two different enterprises with very different products, different market attack strategies?
Well, as much as they're different, they're still very similar. You know, all these early stage businesses, right? It's about raising the cash. It's about hiring the talent. It's about motivating, inspiring the talent, making sure they're focused on the right things, and having kind of a methodology or a cadence involved where you keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the company so that you're steering it in the right direction. And so, I kind of view it as like, when I was GM at Relay Health, I mean, you have divisions of the company. One division's doing marketing and sales, and another division's doing product, and another division's doing this. It's not much different than that, but you have to kind of build up the management team in that division, because in the early days at TicketFire, I was helping process tickets on the weekends, so, I mean, I've been in everything in that company, and now as it's grown up, so I've helped be part of the fabric, so I understand a lot of the inner workings. Not all of them now, though, because we've grown a lot and we have a good team, so it's kind of nice to be out of all of that, but I trust those guys to get it done. And then, when you flip over to SafeWhite, I mean, I didn't know science. I mean, I think I got an A- in biology at Ohio State, and I studied my butt off to get that A-, and I said, okay, that's enough of that. I'm getting out of that. To a certain extent, those principles that I was talking about, hiring good people, motivating them, making sure they're doing the right thing, I mean, that's what SafeWhite's about. And I take the initiative to learn enough about the science that I can communicate it now, like I just did an interview with Business First on SafeWhite today. And, I like to be able to take the complicated and simplify it so that the average person can understand it. And so I think that's real important. And so both with TicketFire and with SafeWhite, yeah, they're totally different, but, you got to know your business. It's part of being a leader. You know your business. And part of SafeWhite and knowing that business is knowing the science. And I'll give you an example of one of the things that's challenging with that is raising money. So when I go to talk to investors about SafeWhite, and I say, okay, now we've got these organic chemists, and this is what the tooth's like, and this is how we bind to the tooth, and da-da-da-da-da. And a lot of venture capitalists, their head will start spinning around because they don't understand the science. And so they're like, okay, that's great, thanks very much. Because they've been schwimbazzled before by somebody with some kind of crazy science they didn't understand, and they lost money. So what I've been doing now is I'm trying to find people that are venture capitalists that I can talk the science to, and they get it. And, like just one example, I just cold called 2 weeks ago. I'm like, okay, capital raise mode for SafeWhite, let's go. So I go through who are the top 10 venture capital firms in the country. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to take 2 hours and see what I can make happen. And sure enough, I'm like, Venrock, okay. I don't know if anybody knows Venrock. They're probably one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in the country. It's venture capitalists meets the Rockefellers, okay? So it's founded in the 1960s. I look at this bio and I'm like, who knows this stuff? Long story short.
Apple Computer. They were one of the original investors in Apple Computer.
Yeah, they did Dollar Shave Club and a bunch of other things. So I just found this lady who can talk the science, right? And we talk the science and she gets it. So, knowing your business is also a big part of that. And, there's a lot of diversity with what TicketFire, SafeWhite, Noxsano, a lot of other things that I do, but I look for big, disruptive ideas in big markets that you can put a really talented team behind to go make it work. So, and that's what I think TicketFire is a big market, disruptive idea. SafeWhite, same thing.
So I've got one more question, and we're going to open it up to everybody who's here. So what do you want to do that you haven't done so far in your life?
Well, one thing I'd like to do is, if hopefully after a couple more successful exits, I want to go to the Himalayas and go up to Everest Base Camp. That's on my list of things to do. I've climbed a dozen of the 14ers in Colorado. I'd like to go to some more extreme skiing places. I've done a little bit of some extreme skiing, but I'd like to do some more before I get too old. So those are kind of two things that are on my list.
Cool. Okay, questions?
We've got a big room, so if you could wait until we get the microphone back to you. Did I see one in the back here? No? You're scratching your head? Sorry. Okay. Any questions? Oh.
Hey, thanks for coming. 2 questions. What do you think you spend too much time doing, and what would you do if you had more time?
Well, I'd like to drink a little less. I've been really on that. So a friend of mine that's very successful and just sold a company for a lot of money says he gives himself a check mark for every day when he has one drink or less. So I'm trying to get as many check marks each week as I can, to be totally honest. Because when you're out raising money, and going to all these events, it's just one after the other. So I just I'm really focused on that. And if I had more time, plus, I mean, that's a simple one. And then I think if I had more time, right now, I would just work harder. Because I think hard work is a part of all of these things. And that's one thing that I will say, I don't see as much in Rev1 as I think that we should have here. I think the lights go out too late or too early in this place. Just be honest with you guys. I mean, when I look around when I was in Chicago and when I was a lot of other places, I think we have a great life in Midwest here. Now, I think we also, people tend to start earlier here than I've seen in like the Valley and in Chicago and in New York. But we have a great work ethic. It's consistent. But I think does anybody watch Silicon Valley? You see that show? I think that show's hilarious. It's on HBO. It's all about startups. It's really cool. You should watch it sometime because some of it's true. Some of it's a little embellished. But they do these sprints where people are like laying at their desk after like 72 hours of being up. I don't think we need to do that kind of thing, but I think we do need to, strive a little bit more. And all the startup community in this town, I think we could work harder. But that's always the case, right? So if I had more hours in the day, I'd work harder.
Any more questions? Oh, there we go.
I was curious what InfoMotion Sports or what Spalding is doing with that right now, if anything, and are you interested in getting back involved in that ever? I love the idea.
Thank you. What's your name? Matt Kelly. Thanks, Matt. InfoMotion Sports. So I actually had a buddy of mine that we were trying to put together a deal to buy it out of bankruptcy. And then it was starting to get complicated because there's a lot of seasonality to that business because about 80% of the basketballs, they started out selling for $299 a basketball, and then we got it down to $199. And they would sell like between November and December because mom and dad would give, Johnny or Mary a basketball for Christmas. It was the coolest one ever. And the problem with that was it was all made in China, and so you had to like pre-order the processors and everything in April, and so you needed like $2.5 million in February so you could pre-order. It just got too complicated, so we decided not to buy it. But Spalding was interesting because they had a $1.2 million note in that deal, and so out of bankruptcy, they were the only guys that got their money back, and so they were kind of really playing with their own money, so they bought it, and then what they've done is they went in and hired the University of Michigan engineer that we had that was the crown jewels of all the knowledge in that. He had got fed up with the founder and moved out to Silicon Valley about a year before the thing went bankrupt. And then he worked out there for 2 years. And then Spalding, once they bought it, they were just patient, slow, plodding. And within a year, then they hired him, and they've now injected him back into the company. So at first we thought they were just going to sit on all the IP and just kind of, not do anything about it. Because Spalding's owned by Warren Buffett, like up through Fruit of the Loom. So Fruit of the Loom owns Spalding. And then Warren Buffett owns, or whatever his empire's called, I forget. They own the thing, and I think I think you'll see something from them probably in a year because they've kind of put the band back together, so to speak. So that's a really cool technology. So last night when you're watching the NBA game, if anybody was watching it, with that technology, it was Bluetooth enabled. So we were working on an app, and we had patents issued on this where to your iPhone, you could have seen the arc of LeBron's shot as it was going up. You say, that was a 47-degree arc, and he had this 110 revolutions per second backspin on the ball, and he released that in 0.7 seconds. I mean, really, it was all about like going to fan engagement, and so the future of sports, that's going to happen in basketball probably within 3 or 4 years. I think you'll see live stats coming out of the basketball, but that NBA basketball is like super highly engineered. And so how you fit the components in there so that it doesn't affect the performance of the ball was kind of an engineering challenge. But that's kind of what ended up with it. So I think it's going to surface under the Spalding name and brand some point.
Okay, so we are currently on Facebook Live right now, and we have a question from Facebook. Pamela Springer, you know her from Oris. She asks, hey, Ray, what kind of weekly metrics and reporting do you collect? What criteria do you use to establish your KPIs?
Hi,
Great.
Pam. Hope you're doing well. So KPIs, I think, are all dependent upon the stage of the business, right? So like with SafeWhite, we just began 2 weeks ago to ship and sell our product. So it's real early on, and so I don't really have a great idea, but I mean, you know, I think some of the fundamentals of business apply to that on how many units we're selling and some of that type of thing. I think TicketFire is a much better example. I'm big on weekly reporting, and everybody that works with me knows this, and so to simplify it, to get to the root of Pam's question, there's 2 ways I like to do weekly reports. What did we accomplish last week, and what are we going to do this week? That tells you everything, right? So you basically plan. So it's plan your work and work your plan. Really simple concept, but do it. So every week, both TicketFire and SafeWhite issue a weekly report saying what we did last week and what we're going to do this week. And as an operator or an executive in any company like this, you'd be amazed at the fundamentals, what that leads you to focus on, because you're just constantly thinking about, I always we do it on Mondays. So Monday morning, I kind of take a step back and say, okay, what did we do last week? And I kind of go through and I'm like, that wasn't planned, and you kind of highlight all that. And then I send it out to a broader team. So it's not only, it's all the key managers get it. And then, for TicketFire then, if you take it another level, because that thing's in full operational mode, I mean, we're looking at how many, because right now we're processing anywhere between probably 10,000 tickets a week, and I think our record in March was like 24,000 tickets or something like that. So we've got all these graphs. I mean, you could go over there in our office and see up on the wall, we got all these graphs and bar charts, and everything's hockey sticking, except for April goes down because that's a seasonality thing. After March Madness, it kind of goes down, but everything about TicketFire is going like that. And so, a good example of that is when you're managing it to this level, you can tell, like when TicketFire was together, we were saying, oh my God, April's horrible. Our revenue is going to be like half of what it was last month. And then we go back and we look at the charts and we say, okay, well in 2017 it went like this, then it went like this. In 2018 or 17 did the same thing, and then you're like, oh, we have a seasonality effect here. Let's not freak out. So those metrics are really important. Keeping your eye on the ball, and thank you, Pam. That would be my 2 cents on that.
So, hi, Ray. I'm Lisa Avedon, and I'm from Fuse. Just quick question of how you inspire or motivate future innovators.
Hi, Lisa. Great question. Thank you. Good stuff you guys are doing there at Fuse. Let's see. By the way, we experimented on Brent's teeth in the early days. So Brent's on the board here at Rev1. Great guy. I think events like this are great for that. I also think that because of whatever the trend is, I don't know the genesis of it, but all of the young college students coming out of college today wanting to be entrepreneurs is great for this country. I think it's huge. I think there's a lot of people jumping into it, and one of the ways that I personally am involved in that, and I think is really good for our community, and the state's involved in that, is through the Venture for America program. So the VFA fellows are great. They're self-identified. They want to be entrepreneurs coming out of college, so much so that they go through a highly selective process to go to boot camp, and I describe them as ninja-trained warriors for startups. I think that's a great program that Andrew Yang put in place out of New York City. He's got a great story. You should check that out sometime. So I think things like that, the Business Builders Club at Ohio State is another excellent example of that. Startup Week, a lot of I think we have a lot of good momentum in this town and in the country around that. So I'm not too concerned about it. I do think that, having people come out of college and jump into startups is a great experience, because then they're going to quickly self-identify whether it's for them or not. And, I remember in a lot of these VFA programs, people come out, but then they get in a startup that runs out of money in a year. And that's a bad thing, right? So they learn quickly that cash, as you talked about, Wayne, is important. So, but yeah, thank you.
When you're implementing a culture, how much and how do you stress that there's an end user who's going to have your product and your service, and that you're improving their quality of life? Like, how do you make that tangible to alleviate burnout or to inspire and kind of get that foundation, your principles going?
Let me make sure I understand the question. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Chris.
Chris,
Yeah,
make
so
sure I understand the question. Could you
when you're
repeat that?
implementing a culture and just like an environment, do you harp on that there's an end user that's going to take your product and your service, and that this is to enhance your quality of life? And I guess how do you do that to keep that on the forefront of their mind?
The way that I think about what you were saying is I consider that a pain point. So identifying the pain point, does the business have a pain point? Does the consumer have a pain point? And what are you doing to address that? So, you know, both, I'll start with SafeWhite. I mean, we've done extensive consumer testing. In Cincinnati, we went to some facility where Procter & Gamble does a lot of their consumer testing, and we threw our kit in front of like 20 people over 2 days and see how they responded to it, and then we iterated and made it better and tried to learn from that. You know, TicketFire, like we're rolling out some new features, and we just went through a process where we talked to 5 ticket brokers, because we have 2,000 ticket brokers, small brokers all the way up to large brokers that use our technology. And so, you know, I'm big with the guys saying, hey, before, you know, we develop these feature sets, let's go talk to some of our customers and see what they say. And, you know, sometimes that's of value. I would say all the time it's a value. Sometimes it's less valuable than other times, depending, like, because you'll get different opinions, right? So if you get an N of 5, you get 2 people that say that's a great idea and 3 people that say it's a bad idea. So, you know, that's where you got to make the calls as a business. And sometimes, you know, it just is this healthy balance of talking to the end user, talking to the business, and then at some point you got to go with your gut, right? So I think sometimes the gut is is underrated. In today's world, though, let's face it, it's quickly moving to a data-driven world. Actually, I'll just share with you a good little sidebar on this, on the data side, because, you know, a lot of these Silicon Valley things today are just all data-driven. They just look like, they say that, you know, Instagram watches Snapchat and just watches whatever Snapchat does, and then, I'm sorry, Facebook Messenger watches what Snapchat's doing, and then like within 48 hours, they've got the features already built back into Facebook Messenger. But this data is driving everything. And so last week I heard this guy, I'll think of his name here in a second. He's written a book about the evils of Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, and how they are destroying the innovation in this country because they just eat everything up. Well, you know, they talk about Google, and you know how Google's all data-driven, right? So everything about Google is data, and they know, you know, and then of course Amazon, they say, knows what you're going to buy before you want to buy it next. So I think getting the data is key in that. And so what methodologies, like if you're going to talk to your end users, what the methodology is on how you know, get the data back from them and then process that data is key. And obviously Google's the best in the world at that. Or as that guy called Google, he calls them God. So he had some very insightful things.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if anyone has one last question.
So 2 different businesses, obviously. How would you compare taking on somebody like P&G on the SafeWhite side with a consumer product versus TicketFire competing with Ticketmaster, but happens to be owned by Live Nation, which also owns all of the venues you are probably trying to get into?
So I'm sorry, compare and contrast them, Aaron?
Yeah, I guess how does P&G compare to a Ticketmaster with the Live Nation factor built in there?
Great question. So P&G, I would say, competes on a level playing field globally, and they're not a monopoly. Ticketmaster is quasi-monopoly, and yes, they've tried to change their business model to acquire venues so that, you know, if an artist wants to perform in there, they're using Ticketmaster. You know, Ticketmaster is a really interesting study because they have about 80% market share. About 80% of what TicketFire does is Ticketmaster tickets. One of the things that I think people don't realize, and I recognize this once I got in the ticketing business, is that Ticketmaster is basically the hired bad cops for a lot of these venues. So what happens is the greatest sales strategy ever. So they go to Ohio State and they say, oh, hey, Ohio State, could we have your ticketing business? We got all these technologies and things to manage all your ticketing. We'll write you a check for $2 million. Oh, well, thank you. I'd like to have $2 million, and you're going to do all this for me too. Great. Then they turn around and then they put fees on the tickets, right? So that they get their money back, and then they get more. So, you know, even better example, and I think, you know, Ticketmaster has a great relationship with Ohio State. They're very tight. You know, we've never been able to get into that. And, you know, what they're doing is they're building a monopoly where they have the primary sale of the ticket, and now with their secondary sale, they're competing with StubHub. So they're winning. They get to do the initials. They make money on the initial sale of the ticket, and then when it gets resold, they make a big chunk of money. And one of the things we're thinking about at TicketFire is democratizing the secondary ticketing market, and instead of charging a percentage, just charge a flat fee of 99 cents every transaction and forget all this percentage stuff. But another little thing that just for you to keep in mind when you go to buy a ticket, like it's Express. Is it Express Live now? Is that what it's still called? Yeah. So if you go to buy a ticket at Express Live, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but it'll be like $20 for a ticket. And then you go to check out, it's $18. And there's a service fee, and there's a electronic ticketing fee, and there's like all this stuff on there. Well, what they do is they charge $38 to you, the consumer, and then you're thinking, well, Express Live's nice. They're only charging me $20, but that doggone Ticketmaster, they're charging me $18. I hate those guys. I hate them. Everybody hates Ticketmaster. Well, then Ticketmaster's turn around, they're giving $9 or something back to the venue, and then the venue's looking, hey, we're just trying to make a way here, do some shows, and that doggone Ticketmaster, they just got the market locked up, and so that's kind of that's a wild business, that ticketing business, and there's a lot of future things coming for like playing sounds to get into events. So like one of the things that'll be happening in the future is a company out of Cincinnati that actually what you'll do is you'll take your phone and you'll play a tone that's an inaudible, so your dog might hear it, but nobody else is going to. And when you go in, instead of showing a barcode, you're just going to play a tone on your phone. And that's how you'll be, that will be your token for getting into events. So that's a company out of Cincinnati called Listener, L-I-S-N-R. But there's a whole bunch of other things with facial recognition. And so ticketing is going to be the Wild West in the next 10 years. There's a ton of disruption coming, and hopefully TicketFire will be able to somehow manage through that. But, SafeWhite's like a meat and potatoes play with P&G. I mean, that's, they basically P&G takes, chemicals and products and sticks them all together in nice little packages and gets them to consumers. So, it's a way different business than Ticketmaster for sure.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time today. Can we get a round of applause for Ray and all his knowledge?
Thank you.